Okay, go ahead. Okay. Hello, Hayes Lodgepole. This is Heather again, and welcome to ACT Prep Session number 4. Today we're going to do many of the things that we've worked on previously. We'll talk about a few ways to relax before the test. We will review the basic overview of the exam as well as strategies we've covered along the way. And we're also going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the content that you'll be working with throughout the test so that you can start to even better narrow down things that you can feel confident about and things you know you need to practice. We will also talk about the essay portion of the exam briefly. However, as always, the best way to get better at writing is to simply write more. As always, I'm available by email at inspiredclassroomheather@gmail.com. Please send me your questions, thoughts, concerns, specific things that I can help you with, as well as that final essay portion of the exam. Before we move on, please make sure that you are prepared with a piece of paper, a pen or pencil, and if you prefer to work digitally, a laptop, a tablet, a cell phone. It's up to you. Please feel free, pause the film now, and grab your materials. All right, so to start out with, as a little warm-up, please think back to our last video session. What stood out to you and why? At this point, these reflections should be starting to narrow down in a little bit more from broad-based understandings of what the test is about to specifically what you are realizing is most applicable to your situation. Please pause the video now and write down 3 or 4 sentences that you remember from last session. And to help narrow in that understanding and self-reflective thinking, I would also like you to take a few more moments, write 2 more sentences specifically about what you are most confident about regarding the ACT. This could be broad test-taking strategies. This could be specific content areas. If you know you are really good at certain points of grammar or punctuation, write that down. If you know you're a great reader, write that down. If you're a stellar persuasive writer, great. Please pause the video, 2 minutes. Thank you. And of course, on the flip side, what have you come to understand is the thing you need to work on most in preparing for the ACT? If you're a particularly anxious test taker, this might be finding ways and practicing ways to calm down in advance of the test and in the middle of the test. And it could be content-specific things as you've been working through the practice exams we've done together. Patterns that you've discovered in the questions you are getting wrong. Please take 2 minutes and reflect on that question now. Of course, as always, please feel free to contact me with this information and I can give you specific help for your own situation. All right, so really quickly, we've talked about this every time, so you should know it by heart, but what makes the ACT different from other tests? If you remember that the primary difference is that there is no wrong answer penalty, that you are simply looking for the answer where it is on the page, you are correct. Even though there are, of course, many other differences between this exam and a classroom exam. More than anything, you simply need to be able to apply the knowledge you already have to the information they provide, as opposed to simply recalling facts, dates, names, numbers. Application is key, and practice is key. So going through these practice exams as we move from session to session to session is absolutely the way to go. All right, so we've talked about a few different ways to exercise test day mindfulness, to keep yourself plugged into the room, to sort of appease some of that anxiety. We know that some of those things include knowing what to expect on test day, reviewing as provided in presentations previously, how many questions you'll be taking, how much time you have on those, and knowing exactly what you're most confident in, what you need to work on. Today we are actually going to practice some breathing exercises because, of course, brains need oxygen. Especially when you are stressed, you'll start to breathe more shallowly, and your brain is not going to get the brain food that it needs to help you be as successful as you can be. So, please actually go through this with me. We're going to do it now. Get yourself comfortable in your chair. Make sure your feet are planted flat on the floor. Feel the weight of your body in the chair. Feel your feet on the floor. Place your hands on your belly if that helps. Relax your shoulders. Okay, breathe deeply and feel your belly rise. Send that breath all the way down to the tips of your toes, feeling your body relax. And breathe out. On test day, before the test, or during the test, you can situate your body in this way and repeat this specific kind of breathing as many times as it takes until you feel that your heart rate is slowing down and your brain is starting to feel a little bit more clear. Let's do it 2 more times. Feet on the floor. Body back in the chair. Shoulders are still, belly rises. Deep breath. Sending it down to your toes. Breathe out that tension. 1 more deep breath. Sending it down throughout your body into your toes. And breathe out that stress and anxiety. If you're a person who likes to keep things a little bit more structured, I would also recommend practicing 4-7-8 breathing, which is actually a strategy that people in high stress occupations tend to use. People who face anxiety in their day-to-day life sometimes use this strategy. Very similar, but you're putting numbers to it. So in this case, you breathe in for 4, hold your breath for 7, breathe out for 8. Let's try it once together. Ready? Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This too can reset some of those anxious feelings and help get that oxygen to your brain. Feel free to jot these down, practice them whenever you would like, in addition to those other mindfulness strategies that we've talked about before. Remember, we've talked about this information over and over, but answering each of the questions is key, even if you have to guess. So if you work half the problems, get them all right, guess on the other half, get about a 23. That's in the top quarter of test takers. Not bad at all. But if you hurry and work all the questions, only get half right, it's more likely that you get around a 19, which is in the bottom half of test takers. So do not hesitate to guess on those items that you're less confident in. And at this point, you should be pretty aware of what those kinds of questions might be. Okay, and I've repeated this information here. If you need to, pause the video, write it down, take a picture. 4 subject tests: English, math, science, reading, and the optional writing. You will be doing the writing. Colleges use the writing to determine where you'll be placed in their writing programs and for other purposes as well. But that writing score is not calculated into your overall score. Again, feel free. Pause the video, jot this down if you need this information. Knowing what to expect is one of the best ways to beat test day anxiety. And again, feel free to jot down this information about the writing portion of the exam. As always, don't forget the ACT mindset. Should know this by heart by now. So please pause the video, jot down a sentence about what in the world is the ACT mindset. has a lot to do with the way this test is different from classroom tests you may have taken before. Your answers may have included thinking, not can I remember, date, name, place. Instead, think, I can figure this out, because the solution is always there in front of you on the page. Think of each section as a separate life, essentially. If you're into video games, that might be a way to think about it. When a section is behind you and you cannot turn back to it, it does no good to dwell on that. Instead, focus on the page that you are on. Consider, should I answer each question or guess and move on, remembering that you will not be penalized for wrong answers. Guessing is encouraged. Be sure you answer every single question. And of course, should I come back to this question later? Is it something I might be able to get with a little bit more time? Again, it's always valuable to know what you know and know what you need to improve. Repeated this, multiple times throughout the course and within this session. But those errors generally fall under memorization, human error, and tricky questions. Memorization being grammar rules, punctuation, so on and so forth for English. Things such as theme and transition for reading, and basic conventions for the writing portion of the exam. This is information that you have learned in your classes, but it never hurts to review. Today we'll be going specifically through some of those items so that if you need to find that information and continue practicing specifically, you can do so outside this course. Human error is filling in the wrong bubble or getting off by one question. If you've noticed that this is happening to you quite frequently, practice some of that deep breathing and slow down just a smidge, because it is better to take that extra half second than to get to the end of your exam and realize that every question is off by one. That sinking feeling is not something that you want to experience, and something that is avoidable. And again, those tricky questions are the times when the ACT will split up a sentence, half on one page, half on the next, in hopes that you will get confused. Or place, for instance, the subject of a sentence and the verb so far apart that you forget what you were talking about in the first place. They do try to find ways to catch you, which might not feel fair. And maybe it's not, but you will be able to find your way around it and succeed. And think to yourself, is one of these error types occurring more than the others, and what can I do about that? Again, please contact me if you need specific strategies for the mistake that you happen to be making more than others. And I'd be happy to celebrate your successes with you as well. All right. Do you remember some strategies that you can keep in mind when you notice you are running out of time? Pause the video. Jot down your ideas now. All right, you might remember that you can look for specific line references and do those questions. Questions that send you to a specific place in the text are generally pretty quick to answer. You can refer to cited information in the passage. So that differs from looking for specific line references in that that part of the text actually shows up in the question. It gives you the information you need. And you can then answer the questions as best you can with the information that shows up in the question. Finally, make sure you answer every question, even if it's a guess. If guessing gives you a little bit of anxiety, it doesn't hurt to choose a letter of the day or a pattern of the day. So no, like when I guess, I'll guess B, I'll guess H. If that's something that you feel takes too much time, that is kind of one of those paralyzing effects, that is perfectly valid, just as likely to hit or miss in those guessing instances. All right, gonna review our English strategies. Pause the video, write down what you remember. as strategies that are specific to the English portion of the exam. Please start with the strategy you are most likely to use and end with the one you feel you personally are least likely to use. You might have remembered that one of those options is to use triage strategy. So in a hospital waiting room, generally that means like, who's bleeding the worst? Who do we need to care for first? In this context, using that metaphor, think about which questions need your attention most urgently and which questions are you most confident in. Then on your second run through your questions, answer the questions that you know you can do with a little bit more time, things that you can return to, and finally, after you've answered that second round of questions, guess on what's left. You might have remembered that it's highly encouraged to write all over your test booklet. Things that stand out to you when you are reading, themes, transitions. If you are reading and you notice an error that you know is an error, you can mark that as a question that you can immediately answer correctly. Of course, remember to read every word of the passage and every word of a sentence you plan to change, especially if you've noticed you're having trouble with those tricky questions, because this will make sure that they don't get you. If you read every word and make sure that you have an understanding of the entire sentence before you choose to change it. Another strategy is to overall look for verbose language and simplify. Do you remember the meaning of the word verbose? If you said that verbose means overly wordy, you are correct. Often we get in the habit of writing too many words for one idea because we are required to write to a certain page limit. We'll write about the delicious yellow sweet banana, 4 words instead of 1. It's not always necessary. Look for places where information is repeated or unnecessary, doesn't contribute to the meaning of the sentence. Find places you can eliminate. Use 1 word instead of 5. And of course, you might have remembered that it's always good to find transition words between sentences and between paragraphs because they often reveal meaning and help you determine what the author is actually trying to say. All right. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit before we actually look at the passage number 3 that we'll be working with today. So if you need to stretch your legs, stand up, do some breathing, that's great, get settled in. We are going to go through some basic English concepts together first in question and answer format so that you can practice determining your answer before you look for it on the page. It saves a ton of time when you are reading all of those answers because of course you read them all. But if you can identify it immediately and you don't have to read them 3, 4, 5 times, you'll be better off in the long run. All right, are you stretched? Are you comfortable? All right. My first question for you is, what is the difference between its, ITS, and its, IT, apostrophe S? Between these questions, you're welcome to pause the video if you need time to jot down your answer. And at the end, we will find the answers to these issues in the text itself. All right, you tell me, when do you use superlative adjectives? That means, for example, most, best, tallest, shortest. And when do you use comparative adjectives? For example, more, less, taller, shorter. This one's a little bit more general. When multiple answers are grammatically correct, which one should you choose? And this one plays into some of those tricky questions. How can you determine the correct use of the verb to be? For this next one, think a little bit about your understanding of verb tenses. There are a lot of verb tenses, but the ones we tend to use most often are past, present, future. Things get complicated, but basically they fall-ish under those categories. So how do you know if a verb is in the correct tense? When a word ends in the letter S, how do you know if it needs an apostrophe? The words for the two different kinds of words that end in S are plural and possessive. Plural has to do with how many. Possessive has to do with who owns it. Verbs don't only need to agree with the subject in tense. Remember, past, present, future. They also need to agree with the subject in number. How do you know if a verb agrees with the subject in number? Can a word that ends in ing work as an adjective? Can an ing word describe a noun? All right, just a few more and then we'll jump into the test. We'll be looking for these answers and be able to pin them to actual examples. So bear with me. 4 more. If you need to stop, stretch, breathe, feel free to do so now. All right, what strategy might help you determine, find out, and remember the meaning of an underlined part of a sentence? If you had to distill it to its basic meaning and remember that for the rest of the passage, what could you do? Is it ever acceptable to remove part of a sentence altogether? If so, when? What is a conclusion? Specifically, what is a conclusion in a paragraph? And overall, what happens when a writer uses I or we in a piece of writing? That question plays a lot into the idea of point of view and who is telling the story. And it might maybe off the bat sound arbitrary, like it's not that helpful, but actually knowing who is speaking will help you answer questions that have to do with tone, comes up a lot, and author's intent. Okay, let's hop on over to the practice exam. If you type in the link that you had available on the screen, that will take you here. You can also Google ACT Practice English, and this will probably be the first thing that shows up. If it looks like this, you're in the right place. And can be very proud of the fact that we've accomplished passage 1 and passage 2. So we're going to jump into passage 3. Take as much time as you need and read through this passage now if you have not already. Please also work to apply the strategy that you wrote down as the one you are most likely to use on test day. All right. You are welcome to, at this time, refer back to the answers to the questions we just talked about together if it will help you determine your responses for this question, knowing that that won't necessarily be available on test day, but for our purposes now, it's a great way to practice some of these basic ideas. Number 1, choose the best answer. So when we refer back to our sentence, we see that number 1 is a form of its. We'll have to decide whether or not this is the correct version of its. And they give us a there. That's confusing. Let's see what's happening here. Whether it's bright and jaunty, or haunting and melancholic, the music of the Andes, do. You may have recalled that its it apostrophe s and its its differ in plural and possessive. So please at this time, select the correct answer. If you selected it apostrophe s, that is correct, and we'll look at the language that the ACT board provides with us at the end as well. All right, let's take a look at number 2. The Antara has its origins in the Incan civilization, once the more richer and more powerful empire in South America. A lot of times your ear is going to tell you when something is wrong. So as you were reading this, you might have thought, that does not sound quite correct. And you may have even made a note in the margin that that's something that you wanted to return to because you knew it was off. Our answers are no change, one of the richest and most, the richest and most, the richer and more. This is an example of the superlative comparative issue that we talked about a few moments ago. There are more than 2 items that we are debating here because we're talking about multiple empires in South America. Remember that comparative has to do with 2 items. Superlative is when there are many items. If you were to say that he was the taller of the 5 boys, your ear would probably go, that's strange. I don't like that. Tells you that you're going to want a superlative. Probably sounds a little confusing, but we'll look at the language the ACT board provides as well. So please click on what you think is the correct answer. All right, number 3. The Antara consists of a connected row of hollow vertical pipes of varying lengths, which are then lined up. Question tells us, given that all of the choices are true, so we can trust that the information in each of these answers is correct, valid information, which one provides the most significant new information? That new information piece might be setting off some bells, because we want to eliminate redundancy. That means we never want to repeat ourselves. So if these answers tell us something we already know, we can eliminate them. So choices are A, no change. The Antara consists of a connected row of hollow vertical pipes of varying lengths, which are then lined up. We kind of know that they're lined up. B, thus forming this musical instrument. We already know that it's a musical instrument. C, arranged from shortest to longest. That's new information. We know they're varying lengths, but we don't necessarily know what order they were in. And finally, D, which are fastened together. Well, I know that connected means the same thing as fastened together, so D is also repetitive. Pretty safe to say that C is probably correct. If you agree, please click that answer. If you do not agree, click the answer that you think is correct. Number 4, the pipes, which can vary numerously from 3 to 15, are fashioned from do. If we wanted to change the word numerously what would we change it to? See if you can think in your mind how you would change this sentence before we look at our answers. E, no change. F, in quantity of numbers. Sounds like a lot of words to me. G, number-wise. And H, in number. Choose the answer that most closely aligns with what you thought ahead of time would be correct. And number 5, each pipe is individually rolled to create the proper pitch before being bound to the other pipes. Anytime you see a form of the word to be, you know that this might be a little bit tricky. If you're not comfortable with the multiple forms of the verb to be, something to review, something to practice, and I would be happy to work with you on that as well and provide some practice sheets and so forth if you need that. If you don't know off the top of your head what sounds correct, since it is tricky, it can be useful to plug the answers into the sentence when it's a short one like this. Before being binded? Sounds strange. Before been bounded. My ear doesn't like that. Before been bound. Those tenses seem strange to me. Let's review the sentence that they provided for us again. Before being bound. Does that sound correct to your ear? Go ahead and select the response that seems most correct to you. And remember that after each question is filled in, clicked, once there's a dot in every bubble, you can click answer. If you're not seeing answer at the bottom, what that's telling you is that you haven't provided an answer for every question. And then you can go up, and the great thing about these ACT board prep questions is they always explain exactly what's happening. So you can see for number 1, we wanted to change ITS to IT apostrophe S, because in this case, the meaning of that is it is, as the question explains. Otherwise, the introductory dependent clause, if you don't necessarily know what that means, it's okay. You can just say the first part of the sentence. Your ear tells you that information. No one on the test is going to ask you for the words introductory dependent. But do know that there would have been no subject or verb in that case. We need both words, it is, in order to make that work. Take a look at number 2. You might remember this was the second thing that we looked at in our questions before. In this case, we would want the superlative. It is the richest and most powerful because there are more than 2 empires in all of South America at this time. And in that case, you always want your superlative, the est, the tallest, the fastest, the shortest, the best, the most. All right, number 3. If you determined that answer C gave you the best, newest information, you are correct. Take a look at number 4. This is very similar to the last question in that we want to find the answer that is the least repetitive. We already know can vary in number. Tells us that they don't have the same number of pipes. So do find the most concise way to finish the sentence. Finally, number 5, if you did not change that sentence and recognized that binded, been are all past tense forms of the verb to be, you are correct. And you can review the reasoning below. Don't be thrown off or frustrated or confused by words like present participle and so on and so forth, because again, if you can find the correct answer on the page, that's all that matters. You won't be asked to explain your answers. These explanations are just a way for you to better understand the things that you need to practice. So I would like you to go ahead and please complete pages 2 and 3 of questions for passage 3 that we've been working on together. You will probably notice that as you work through these questions, you've already addressed some of the information and the questions we worked on before. Feel free to refer back to your notes and write down anything that is confusing or unclear. And I would be so happy to spend more time addressing those things with you. Otherwise, we'll continue doing just sort of a broad overview of these basic concepts. Additionally, these are things that may not show up as you're working through these questions, but they're good to look for. So no words that sound alike. Homophones, should've, would've, could've, versus should, of, would, of, could, of. Again, those tricky uses of the verb to be. Look for transition words. There's a partial list available here. And again, look for parallelism. When a sentence is broken up and each part kind of replicates the last in form. So the verb is in the same place and it's in the same tense. Subject's in the same place. Or if, for instance, you have adjectives and nouns, those are in the same place in the same form. Boom, boom, boom throughout the sentence. Okay, that was a lot. If you need to take a break, stretch, a breath, please feel free to do so. Don't feel overwhelmed. That was a lot of information to work through at once. But it is in the same order as the questions that you will be working on. And hopefully it's sort of getting you in the habit of looking for that answer, thinking, activating what you know before you look for it on the page. I'm here for you. If any of that was super confusing, I can help you with it specifically. Just let me know. All right, once you're stretched and comfortable, please take a couple minutes and jot down reading strategies now in order of those you are most likely to use first, those you are least likely to use last. You may have jotted down active reading, which is somewhere between skimming and scanning and a close read. So it's reading with a medium close eye, looking for main ideas and transitions. Might have remembered the 3-passage strategy, in which you find the passage that you like the least. You never want to look at it again. It's terrible. You're probably not going to get the answers. You guess at all 10 of those questions. Go back to your first favorite, work through them all. Second favorite, work through them all. Third favorite, work through them all. This is particularly useful if you know that you probably won't be able to work quickly enough to get them all actually answered in the time given, which is not at all uncommon. However, if you know that you can work through all 4 passages because you've done it, you've timed yourself, this may or may not be the strategy for you. Skimming and scanning is exactly what it sounds like. You skim the top of the material after you've read it the first time in depth, and then you skim back through and look for the words and ideas that jump out at you, because they tell you a lot about what the author has to say and the author's purpose. Questions of author's purpose come up a ton in these reading questions. Passage mapping is a great strategy across the board. Again, it's taking those notes in the margins with a closer eye to structure or organization. thinking about not only what the author has to say, but why they put it in the order that they did. All right, and if you decide 3-passage strategy is not for me, I'm going to try to complete all 4. You are also welcome to start with a passage you prefer, be that prose fiction, short stories, social studies, humanities, or natural sciences. And in this case, you will be starting with your favorite, working through, and then guessing, using some of those guessing strategies on the ones that you cannot get to in time. And finally, as always, no matter what strategy you use as you read, it's always helpful to look for those adverbs and transitions. Adverbs describe how something is being done, and those tell you a lot about tone, and again, author's intent. Those are words that are describing the action that's happening, and transitions take you from one point to the next. Okay, so as we work through some of these questions for the reading portion of the exam, it's going to look a little bit different than it did when we did English, because so much of the reading portion involves simply going back and finding evidence for your answer in the text itself and being able to explain why the correct answer is correct. So, of course, when an answer lists multiple items, so if each answer has 3 parts, boom, 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 every portion of that answer needs to be correct. So it's not good enough to have, 2 of the 3 in the text. You have to be able to find every part in the passage itself. So how then do you summarize a paragraph? How do you find the most important information? As you're reading through and doing your passage mapping, finding those main ideas, summarizing paragraphs, feel free to make a note of the role of different people, especially if there are many, many characters within a passage. It's really easy to forget who is who and what they did. So by all means, write that down in the margins. How do you know when a question in the text itself, so this is not the questions you're answering. If there's a question in the passage, how do you know if that's a serious question or a rhetorical question? A rhetorical question is a question that the reader is expected to know the answer to and is being used to make a point. And of course, this last item is something that you will be able to use when you're preparing and practicing for the test. Not applicable on test day because you won't have access to a smartphone or a dictionary. But while you're preparing, write down words that you don't understand and look them up. The more words you know, the better you'll be able to identify redundancy and think about what the author is actually trying to say. So now we're going to pop over to that reading practice exam. If you need to pause and take a break, please feel free to do so. You've completed passage 1, passage 2. We're going to jump in again on passage 3. You probably noticed that passage 1 was a narrative, a story. Passage 2 is social studies. And number 3, we're going to be looking at humanities, things like English and drama, in this case, poetry. Please take a moment, read this passage if you have not already. Let's take a look at question number 1. Which of the following most fully lists solutions considered by the author to the problem that the list of beloved women poets is not nearly as long as the list of beloved men poets? That's a lot of information. Let's pick that apart a little bit. Which of the following most fully lists solutions? So that tells me that this is an instance when we are going to want to make sure that every part is true. It's not good enough for just 2 of the 3 to be correct. Need to be able to find evidence for all 3 parts in the passage itself. All right, so we know what we're looking for in our answer, which the following most fully lists solutions considered by the author. So we're not just looking for solutions that might work. We're looking for solutions that the author themselves said would be a good idea. Finally, to the problem that the list of beloved women poets is not nearly as long as the list of beloved men poets. We can see from the phrase, the problem that this is a fact. We can take this to be true. The issue that we're looking at is the imbalance between the list of beloved women poets, beloved men poets. So we don't need to question that is sort of the centerpiece of this question. We can take that as fact. So if we had to look back at this passage, where do you think you would find solutions to this problem that the author poses? Is it likely that those solutions are in the very first paragraph? Probably not, because that's when we find out what the problem actually is. And it's unlikely in a passage like this, when something is posed as cause and effect, problem, solution, that you're going to find that at the beginning. You may have also jotted down notes about these solutions when you were writing in the margins. If you were using passage mapping, you might have noticed that structure is very much problem-solution oriented, and you're already going to know to go to the end. Scrolling, scrolling. Using those skimming and scanning skills, looking at words that stand out. Yep, we see that we're still talking about the problem. The fact is we can't have it both ways. But here we have a rhetorical question. But what is all this rating and counting and classifying of authors about anyway? If we set up one writer against another, aren't we giving in to what some feminists tell us is the adversarial mentality of patriarchal culture? Another rhetorical question. It's a question. That's not a solution. Even though maybe some of those terms might be tough to wrangle with, question mark tells me that's not a solution. I see the word answer. Practically speaking, most of us who are habitual readers of poetry already have an answer. Now we're getting somewhere. While acknowledging our profound differences of taste, we never doubt that there are good poems and terrible poems, and that the good ones are the only ones we have time for. Okay? What else can be done about the fact that the list of the best women poets is not as long as the men's list? That sounds exactly like our question. In addition to looking closely for unjustly neglected women, one solution, one might question whether some men poets have been overrated. I think for some reason of poets whose names contain double W's. And while I would be sorry to throw out all of them, I confess that each of these poets has at times bored me to tears. So perhaps she's saying the second solution is to identify overrated male poets. We have 2. We see that each of our answers has 3. What else might we need to do? The problem with taking men poets down a peg, however, is that it's hard to do so with discernment. The zeal to undo immediately the centuries of neglect and abuse endured by woman poets has resulted in the devaluation. Still not giving me a solution. Let's go back and see if we are expected to distill meaning from the author's intent. So A, reading women poets who have never been read, rejecting the writing of those whose names contain double W's, and redefining what's good about the literary canon. Well, we know that she doesn't necessarily want to reject all those writers whose names contain double W's. B, reappraising the literary canon. That's the list of big, important books that we're all expected to read in school. Adding new women's names to the list. Weighing the importance of some male poets. And reading work by women as yet not widely read. C, questioning the importance of some male poets. Encouraging readers to study women's journals. Didn't see much about that. And creating a world in which women will flourish. D, promoting the best work of current women writers. Rediscovering older writers. Reappraising Matthew Arnold's view of criticism. And acknowledging differences in literary taste. Based on your notes and our reading together, which of these seems the most specifically true? Make a note of any answers that you can eliminate because parts of them are untrue. And please click on the answer that you believe is most correct. Number 2, which the following sentences best summarizes the first paragraph? Here's where some of those summarizing skills come into play. You will be asked to distill larger pieces of meaning down to like their utmost core. One really great way to do this is to look at the first sentence and the last sentence and weigh them against each other and see what they're trying to say. Let's take a look at that first paragraph. The time is overdue to admit that there is something of a vacuum in women's poetry, and that we abhor it. For a woman to concede this is not disloyal to her sex. It's the first step in the creation of an environment in which women artists will flourish. But what can be done about the fact that the list of beloved women poets is not as long as the list of beloved poets who were born male? So we see, if we look at the beginning, there's a vacuum in women's poetry. The list of beloved women poets is not as long as the list of beloved poets who were born male. Before answering, jot down what you think a good summary of that paragraph would be. And we'll look at those responses together. E, it is disloyal to encourage women to write and to ask, why do male poets flourish more readily than female poets? No, we can clearly see that it is not disloyal. F, we must ask why there are so few women writers. Perhaps asking this question will create a woman-centered culture. Do we know yet whether the author intends to create a woman-centered culture? Not yet. G, it can be liberating to ask questions such as, what can be done about the fact that there are fewer beloved male poets than female poets? And H, if we admit that there is not enough quality poetry written by women, it can make it easier to discover why this is so and help us change the situation. Keep in mind that every part of an answer has to be correct in order for it to be counted as right. So if any portion is incorrect, you can count that answer out. Please click on the answer you think is most correct. Number 3 is one of those questions that you can return back to if you find that you are running out of time. It may be reasonably inferred from lines 10 to 17, so you know exactly where to go back. This isn't a big, broad, thematic question where you have to know what the author is saying overall. You simply have to be able to figure out what's happening in lines 10 through 17. So let's take a look at those lines. We know it's a quote because James Merrill is talking to us, and James Merrill is not the writer of this passage. As James Merrill writes, Lowell called her one of the 4 best women poets ever, which can hardly have pleased Miss Bishop, who kept her work from appearing in women's anthologies. Better, from her point of view, to be one of the 40 or 40,000 best poets and have done with it. When we infer, we look for information that might not be explicitly said, but that can be reasonably deduced from the text. You always have to be able to find evidence, reasons in the text. So it may be reasonably inferred from lines 10 to 17 that James Merrill respected Elizabeth Bishop's poetry and wished that her reaction to her poems had not been complicated by gender issues. B, but was disturbed by her refusal to be included in women's anthologies. Disturbed is a strong word. I would be curious to see if there was evidence for that in the text. C, but felt she should be more concerned with women's issues. D, and was glad she was one of the 4 best women poets ever. Let's take a look again. Lowell called her one of the 4 best women poets ever. Do we see anything about being disturbed or glad in that?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Which can hardly have pleased Miss Bishop, who kept her work from appearing in women's anthologies, better from her point of view to be one of the 40 or 40,000 poets and have best poets and have done with it. He adds, if I raise the issue at all, it's to dissociate her from these shop-worn polarities. Polarities where things are either this or that, far ends of the spectrum. We can see that he agreed that she didn't necessarily need to be on the spectrum, one thing or the other. So the only answer that is completely correct is that he wished reaction to her poems had not been complicated by gender issues. If you need to stop and stretch, stop and breathe, please feel free to do so at any time. Number 4 is an instance when you may have found it helpful to write down the role of these different people in the passage. There are many names who did different things. And we also have a specific line reference that can be helpful if you find you're running out of time. So according to the 3rd paragraph, lines 25 to 39, we're here already. Fantastic. Emily Dickinson's career was helped by Helen Hunt Jackson. Let's see if we can find Helen Hunt Jackson. I see her name here from skimming and scanning, and I see that Helen Hunt Jackson, that once celebrated, now forgotten poet, whose work Dickinson herself admired. We know Helen Hunt Jackson was a poet. We also know that Emily Dickinson admired her. We see she was another sister in this story, for she alone fully understood Dickinson's gift. Jackson wrote to Dickinson, urging her to publish. You are a great poet, and it is wrong to the day you live in that you will not sing aloud. So we'll go back up to our question here. Did Helen Hunt Jackson publish her? No. Did she encourage her? Yes. Promising. But G also includes encouraged. And H gives us taught her. Let's look at the next piece of information here. Mabel Loomis Todd. Aha! I see. Her editor, Mabel Loomis Todd, painstakingly transcribed. That means copied over. Nearly illegible scraps using a bizarre typewriter. Encouraged her. Mabel Loomis Todd, who transcribed her work using a bizarre machine. Promising. Finally, Lavinia Dickinson. Lavinia Dickinson. Let's see if we can find... Emily Dickinson, after all, would not have become one of the most revered poets in the world had her sister Lavinia not rescued her poems from the obscurity of a dresser drawer. Now it's just a matter of putting the pieces together. So which answer is 100% true? There are many answers here that are only partially true, that only have the correct role of 2 of the 3 people. Please find the answer that is correct throughout the list and click the one that you think is right. And finally, number 5. Which of the following most clearly distinguishes between the 2 ways suggested by the author's assertion that we can't have it both ways? Line 54. So immediately jump over line 54. For the fact is, we can't have it both ways. Sounds like a transition sentence. Let's keep reading. We can't simultaneously espouse the line that women haven't until recently been allowed the depth of education and experience to become Shakespeare, while also claiming that we really have an abundance of Shakespeares if anybody would just take the time to read us. Back up to the question. Our options are A, women haven't until recently been allowed to see the depths in Shakespeare, but nobody bothers to read Shakespeare anyway. B, women haven't written as well as men because they've been too busy being spouses, but nobody takes time to read women writers anyway. You might notice that this isn't the same use of the word spouse. Women haven't written as well as men because they have not had the same educational opportunities, yet there are many great women writers no one reads. Finally, women have always had an abundance of Shakespeares, yet have not experienced the kind of education it takes to appreciate Shakespeare. Let's go back to the text. We can't simultaneously espouse, believe in, the line that women haven't until recently been allowed the depth of education and experience to become Shakespeare, while also claiming that we really have an abundance of Shakespeares if anybody would just take the time to read us. Go ahead and click the answer that you believe is most correct. Scroll way down to answer. Scroll all the way back up. And you can look at the reasoning behind those answers. The explanations here are fantastic because they tell you not only the reason for that answer, but they also show you where to go back in the text. So when you get these answers wrong, I would highly encourage you to follow those line references and actually look at the passage itself, find that information for yourself, and see what note you wrote down about it so you know what you need to look for on test day. Let's look at this next one. I see that I fell prey to the human error issue, but it's a great example of what this website will tell you if an answer is incorrect. So we can see the best answer is not G, even though the author does pose this question. It's not the main focus. But of course, the best answer is H, because the time is overdue to admit there's something of a vacuum in women's poetry, and it tells us this is the first step in changing that situation. Okay, and here, this takes us back to Merrill's quote. So if that was confusing and hard for you to understand, this can help sort of piece that apart for you. And this one's great because if you click on the incorrect responses, for instance, H, it will tell you exactly which piece in that list is wrong. So you can go back and look for it and practice making sure every part of the answer is correct. So there's only one more page of questions for passage 3. I would like you to go back in using the strategy that you chose and finish those questions. And if anything is particularly confusing, please reach out. I would be happy to help you. Now, feet on the floor. Take a deep breath. Notice if your shoulders are tight, if your heart is racing. Breathe in. Breathe out. You made it through some big stuff, a lot of content today. I hope that you are finding ways to apply the strategies in English and reading that we've talked about. I would be thrilled to talk to you more about the exam, the essay portion of the exam. I love reading students' writing, and I love responding to it and finding ways to make the process a little bit better. But I can't do that without your writing to work with. We can look at the examples and the scoring guide as much as we want. But until you practice putting pen to paper, it won't serve you anywhere near as well. Writing is like a muscle, and if you can go to the gym to build up your muscles, the more you write is exactly the same. Your writing will only improve, and you'll feel much better about it come test day. So please set a timer, respond to the practice prompt, and send that essay to inspiredclassroomheather@gmail.com. If you are totally unsure where to start, remember that the 5-paragraph essay isn't the be-all, end-all only way to write an essay, but it is a great way to start if you don't know where to begin. Remember that that is an introduction, conclusion, 3 body paragraphs that provide evidence. Remember that in this prompt, you are asked to choose a stance from those that are provided. Be sure to read them all completely and figure out how your own opinion works together with those responses. You may agree, you may disagree, somewhere in between. So again, please go through that exercise, send it to me, we'll talk about it. Thank you very much. I hope this helped. Reach out at any time. I'm always available. Thank you.